Tim is the executive director of a ministry called Distant Shores Media. He's doing some very innovative thinking, in particular in the area of open access collaboration. And he'll be sharing a lot about that. And he has started with a background in Bible translations. He spent 10 years with Wycliffe as a Bible translator in Thailand, Brazil, and Papua New Guinea. So this guy's really smart. He's really nice. He's just a good guy. And I just found out, did you know, Keith, he's coming out with a book? I didn't know that. Like, when your friends don't tell you little things like, oh, yeah, I got a book coming out. I guess we're not really that close. Anyway, this is my good friend, Tim Jory.
I've really enjoyed our time together so far, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak on a topic that I got involved with pretty much by accident. I did not intend to go into this realm, the intersection between open and mobile, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I would not have been there except for having run into the problem of what happens when you don't have the open part of the equation and you need it. I want to start with looking at the context in which we find ourselves today and why this creates a very significant set of opportunities and set of needs for world missions in the 21st century. You've probably seen this chart before showing the rise of world population. Of note is that world population reached 1 billion people only 200 years ago. So we have this relative flat line throughout history until about 200 years ago, and then it just shoots straight up as population has continued to climb. We're also seeing other advances, other growth curves going up exponentially. This is the rise of the global south. That's a term you're maybe familiar with. That is, in this case, we're talking about the percentage of the Protestants outside of Europe and North America. So we can see that 200 years ago, we had about 1% of Protestants living outside of the global north, so to speak. 100 years later, it was up to 10%, and now today, we're over 2/3 of Protestant Christians are outside of what was traditionally the stronghold of Christianity. This chart is taken from data in Philip Jenkins' book. He says in that book that the center of gravity has moved to the global south. So if we're looking for the religion that is going to affect the largest number of lives in the 21st century, it's almost certainly going to be Christianity. This is both a good thing and also a very sobering wake-up call as we realize that the vast bulk of training resources, discipleship materials, the content that is needed for
Call has
health
been
and for
placed
growth
in conference.
is contained outside of the global south. It's contained in other languages, namely English. So there's a tremendous need there. In addition to the rise of the global south, we see the rise of mobile technology on that same spectrum. It turns out not a lot was happening in the 1800s in mobile. 1900s as well. I read that the first mobile device was built in 1946, and in 1930 they actually had a way to connect a phone by radio to an ocean liner. It costs about $90 a minute or something like that, relatively speaking. Anyway, so we see the astronomical rise of mobile here. We've already heard it so far in this conference that we are expecting in the very near future we're going to have more mobile phone subscriptions than people worldwide. Incredible things happening. We could look at other charts as well. We could plot on this also the rise of mobile capabilities. Phones getting smaller, more capable, tend to have longer battery life, color screens, etc. But we want to look at these three for now. And we want to try and put them and find out where we are on that scale. So if we take those three and we put them roughly to scale, we are right down here. We're at an incredible point in history where all these things are just exploding. There's an exponential growth curve. That's where we are. And I think that is very significant for our purposes here, what we're looking at in terms of world missions and ministry in general. Some of you are probably aware that there are roughly 6,800 languages in the world today. If we were to break up those languages based on number of speakers, very straightforward. There's about 8 languages that have over 100 million speakers each, the mega languages. By contrast, there are over 2,000 languages that have between 1,000 and 10,000 speakers. That's very significant. When we actually plot out the number of people in those categories, we see that speaking languages having more than 100 million speakers each are 2.3 billion people, and about the same number speaking in languages that have between 10 million and 100 million speakers. By contrast, you get down here to the languages that have fewer than 10,000, and this whole block down here combined is a little over 8.3 million. Now, that is significant from a missiological standpoint because in the Scriptures, it seems pretty clear that God is not making a distinction based on the number of speakers in a language. It turns out that every language, every people group is equal in value in terms of who's going to be represented, and therefore, in terms of our missiological strategy, we need a strategy that accounts for all of them, regardless of how many speakers they have or how many speakers they don't have. I'm going to pause right here. Instead of doing a monologue with a few questions at the end, at this point, I want to open it up for questions anywhere between now and we'll see where we go on this. Anything so far that we've covered that anyone wants to clarify or add something to? It is up. It should be. Yeah. All right. Wave your hand if you got a question at any point, and would love to have interaction. So the one way of looking at it is that more than half of the world's languages have fewer than 10,000 speakers each. That's incredible, and it's very, very difficult sometimes to wrap our minds around that. What do we do with that? How do we get content into that number of languages with so few speakers? The vast bulk of those languages in the lower half, the bottom half of that chart, literally, when it comes down to adequate discipleship resources, it's safe to say they have nothing. They do not have what they need to be able to understand the Word of God. They maybe do not have the Word of God. In many of them, they don't have anything. Some of them, they'll have portions. There is just an unprecedented need. So what can we conclude from this? There are hundreds of millions of new believers, thousands of languages in desperate need of discipleship resources, and virtually all of them own or have access to a mobile device. So we have options. What are we going to do about that? We can do nothing. If we look at a people group, at a language group, one response, and it is the default, is to do nothing. I'm going to suggest right up front that that's not a viable option, that doing nothing should not be the default. There should be some way to do something. Second option is to do it for them. Okay, we're going to go in and we're going to get this resource into their language for them. We're going to do the bulk of the work, and that'll be our project. And the third is to help them help themselves. And you can see where I'm going with this, but let's take them one at a time. For well-intended people who want to do something in world missions to get content to the people who need it most, the default is to do it for them. At least that has been the historical default. There are a number of new projects coming on, new ways of approaching this task. We'll get to those in a couple minutes. The default is to do it for them. This is, if we're going to illustrate it, we could use the model of a library. We have our content. The content may be translated, and then it's in basically a silo, a database of some sort, some way of keeping it. And then there is a distribution portal. This is the access point to that content that's stored in the library. The consumer down here gets read-only access to the content. They're not given permission to do anything but consume, really. So they consume the content, and then the analytics go back in. We can see this in the classic brick-and-mortar library. My children in Minneapolis, they go to the Hennepin County Library System. That's the library that we're a part of. They go to the Edina branch. They get books out that they read, and hopefully they do not color in them. We've had to talk to the 2-year-old about not doing that. It's read-only, darling. Don't do that. And then back in goes the analytics. Who checked this book out? How many times was it checked out? How long did they have it? Like that. This model, as a whole, has been taken verbatim into the digital era. Hello, Kindle Library in Amazon. Same thing. Here's their library. Here's your Kindle reader. You get access to the content. You don't get to do anything with it. You just consume. This is not a broken model. This model works very, very well for what it was intended to do. And what it was intended to do is to provide read-only access to the consumer. Comments on this? Questions on this? This model is not broken, but it is limited. It's a model that does not scale well to go to the ends of the earth. Because it's built on the all rights reserved concept in copyright law, it is, by definition, it's exclusive ownership. So the content that is in here is exclusively owned by whoever owns the copyright on that. Using this model to try and go to every language group in the world can be expensive. It tends to be very expensive, tends to be time-consuming, and rarely does it push out to the the farthest endpoints, the linguistically least of these. Let me give you an example. How many here are familiar with the book The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren? It's probably the most successful, however we want to define that, discipleship resource in recent history in terms of numbers sold. Within 5 years of it being published, it was translated into 56 languages, and 30 million copies were sold. By any metric, that's very, very impressive. So we look at that. That's with the marketing and resources of the Zondervan engine behind them. And in 5 years, it got to 56 languages. I'll be honest. I'd love to get something of mine into 5 languages, into 56 languages in 5 years. But when you do the math and you extrapolate it out over all the languages in the world, you see that it doesn't scale well over time. If they could maintain that same rate over time, to get to every language in the world would take about 600 years. And we're not even taking into account that by the time they get, past the first block right there, it gets more difficult and more complicated as the languages get smaller and more remote. Now, let me hasten to say there are examples of projects built on this system that have been able to go much farther and relatively faster, but pretty much all of them have significant expense, both in terms of personnel, overhead, and just the funding to actually be able to create the content to get it out there. So that's our option for doing it for them. If we're going to look at another option, what if we help the global church to do it themselves? This has great potential. We have a lot of people in the world, a lot of Christians. What if we all work together in this? This is the right first step, but the default is we're still going to have exclusive ownership of this, and if you want to do anything with it, you've got to ask permission. Now, I'm not knocking that. That makes a lot of sense, and that's the way that we do things here, and it works pretty well for us. This does create an absolute roadblock for the global church, as can be seen in the flowchart. We put this together. You can't really read it here. You'll see it in the PDF of this if you want. Put this together with our intellectual property attorney to try to understand what is every step along the way of just getting permission to translate or use someone else's discipleship resource. This is dotting the I's and crossing the T's, which is the right way to do things. It's really the only way to do things if we're serious about not winding up in major legal problems somewhere down the line. Each of these questions has to be answered with a yes to be able to go on to the next one. If any of these questions is answered with a no, you drop out to the resource cannot be legally used and you have no other alternative. Now, put this in the context of my friend James in a village in the highlands of Papua New Guinea who has never heard of copyright law. He doesn't even know which questions to ask. All he wants is discipleship resources in his language. I had a phone call recently from a brother in India who is aware of our work getting content on mobile phones, and he was asking for discipleship video to put on his phone. He says, I need this. I'm going on a missions trip. I guess it was an evangelism video. Can you help me? And I told him, I said, look, I know the content exists, and I would love to give it to you, but we actually don't have permission to redistribute that. See, it's under copyright. And the phone went dead. At least I thought it did. There was this long pause. And finally he comes back on and he says, I don't know this copyright of which you speak. All I know, I need evangelistic videos on my phone, and I don't have them. That's the way the global church sees copyright law and the system that we have used for the last 300 years in the West. So what we need some way to see an exponential growth curve that can match the rise of mobile, the rise of population, the rise of the global south in terms of discipleship resources in every language and on the mobile devices of the church. And I want to suggest that exponential growth curve can happen, but it happens when we help the global church in the open world. I apologize, you can't see that very well. Through open collaboration, open licensed content, and open source software. The open model is built on the notion that what I create, we all collectively own, rather than what I create, I exclusively own. It's an important distinction because copyright law affords me, the content creator, all the rights. Up to 70 years after I die, everything belongs to me, all rights. Until I proactively release some of those rights, that's the default. That's the way it stays, until I purposefully release some of those restrictions. You've probably heard the open idea floated around. You've maybe got some opinions on that. One of the things that has really opened my eyes to this whole open approach as a realistic model for the church comes from the Scriptures itself. If you recall in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, these are passages that I think we maybe tend to skip over really quickly because it doesn't maybe fit with some of our preconceived notions. It's talking about those who had property who willingly gave it up for the sake of the church. And what it actually says is they held all things in common. They gave it up voluntarily. This is not Christian socialism. This isn't a mandate to become Christian communists. It's a voluntary giving by those who have for the benefit of the entire body. It's very interesting to see the outcome of that in Acts chapter 4 where it says there was not a needy person among them. So is it a stretch to say the same model that the early church used to meet physical needs could also be used in the digital era to meet spiritual needs for content, discipleship resources? I think it is. Another passage to consider on this topic is 1 Corinthians 9:12. In the context of the worker being worthy of his wages, reaping physical reward for spiritual blessing, in that context, Paul says, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. It is a right. But he says, we willingly do not make use of this. Rather, we endure anything instead of creating an obstacle for the gospel. So we're talking about, admittedly, a significant paradigm shift. This is a big change. It's a total change from the way we've done things in the classic model. Comments, questions? Go ahead, Jim.
Is it possible if you release the right to recollect the work, if someone else changed the title and then decide they restrict access and challenge your legal right to use something that is copyrighted like that? That has been my fear up to now, of saying, yeah, I'm having to give it away, but what if someone else says now they own it?
Okay. So the concern is if I have content, I release it, and then someone else claims it, changes the title, says it's theirs, and tries to lock me out. We are going to address that. That all comes down to how you actually license it and the way copyright law works. By the way, I forgot to give my standard disclaimer. I'm not an attorney. I've done a fair bit of reading on this, but I will very readily punt to IPR and legal counsel if something gets too deep for me too quickly. But yes, we will address that in the terms of the license that I'm going to suggest. Go ahead.
One quick thing is you can still register it as your copyright with the Copyright Office. That's independent of the license that you choose to use to distribute it.
That's right. Copyright and the rights that are afforded to you by the law happen at the point of fixation. As it's been explained to me, that's where you click Save in your Word document. It belongs to you. All rights are reserved. You don't need to register anything for it to belong to you. It is yours right now, and that's defensible. If you want to seek damages, then you may need to have that actually registered with the appropriate authorities. But for it to belong to you and you to have all requisite rights is just by virtue of the fact that you've created it. And that is pretty much the standard for the vast majority of countries around the world, legal jurisdictions around the world. And then it becomes what you do with the license. If you take that and put it right into the public domain, then people can create stuff from that, and what they create from it, they could copyright. It gets nuanced. We'll talk about a license that prevents that kind of thing from happening. Other questions on this? Go ahead.
Just a quick comment. I actually am a lawyer.
Uh-oh.
I don't specialize in copyright, but... Sorry. Yeah, I was saying I actually am a lawyer, and while I don't specialize in copyright, I've done a good bit of research on it, and so far what you're saying is right. So I'll just go ahead.
Wow.
There you go.
That is such a relief. I motion I stop now while I'm ahead, and before we get into trouble. Okay, just for the sake of clarity, there is a good degree of, it's very easy to misunderstand what open actually means. Open is different from open-ish, and it's different from opener, and it's different from kind of open, and it's different from we want to be open, but we're not quite there. Open is open, or it's not. It's a binary, either it is or it isn't. You cannot have it both ways. That's a fundamental principle of logic, to say nothing of the open world. So basically, an open project is one in which no one ever, anywhere, for any purpose, needs to ask permission or is restricted, we could say it that way, from doing anything with the content. That's how open it is. Now, let me explain that. That doesn't mean that they have admin access to our open project that we're doing online. It means they are welcome to take that content and go do something else with it, subject to the terms of the license, but we don't maintain the right to restrict them from doing anything with that content. Does that make sense? That's how open it is. And yes, it can feel really, really scary when you're going there for the first time. We had one person who had completed a book. Publishers were hounding to get this thing published. And the author made the statement, I'm going to release it under this license that I'll talk about next. But you're welcome to publish it if you want. They said, that's fine. And this author said that when releasing it under this open license, actually signed off on it, said it was a little bit like putting my baby out in the Nile River. Either alligators are going to eat him, or God is going to really do something great with this. I can't think of a better description for that feeling when you actually go from closed to, you know what, anyone who finds this can do anything, and they're accountable to God for it, not to me. Okay, open collaboration, just quickly, we mentioned that in the previous slide. Open collaboration is similar to crowdsourcing. It incorporates elements of crowdsourcing, but it's kind of bigger than crowdsourcing in that it's a process for creating content or accomplishing an objective that encourages and depends on self-selecting individuals to basically do everything. So they don't have a formal connection to the project. They say, hey, I like what you're doing, and I could help out in this, and they just do it. There's no application processes. They just jump in and are a part of it. So we talked about what happens in the all rights reserved world and the obstacles that are created when we have to try and ask permission to use the content. The license that, after our research, we've put a lot of time into this, the license that we believe goes the distance to the ends of the earth and preserves what needs to be preserved without restricting what shouldn't be restricted is called the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license. Sounds complicated. It's actually very, very simple. It says basically what I have released under this license, you are free to do anything. You can distribute it. You can build on it. You can do translations of it, whatever. You can even make commercial use of it. That's fine with us, subject to two conditions. You point a hyperlink back to our website whenever you use it or distribute it, and whatever you create from it, you release under the same license, so that what was intended to be free and open stays free and open. For instance, we're working on a project called Open Bible Stories, openbiblestories.com. This is 50 stories of the Bible, start to finish, the key ones that you have to have, text, audio, video. The whole project is released under this attribution share-alike license. Today, if you want to go and download the PDF that's available there, and you want to go take it to a publisher, print it, and distribute 1 million copies and make money off them, that's great. We've got no problem with it, and you don't owe us a dime. Reason is, we care more that that content get out to the people by any means necessary rather than we control and do it in our name. That's the paradigm shift that happens under the open license. Content under an attribution share-alike license, that's the logo for it there, comes down to your permission to use it is automatically pre-cleared subject to one question. Are you willing to give attribution and release what you create from it under the same license? And if you are, you win. You can use it for absolutely anything. You can repurpose it. Open Bible Stories isn't even done yet, and we've had people take it, fork it graciously into meeting their own needs, and it's being broadcast in Urdu on Pakistani TV. It's incredible what happens in the open world. So we saw the silo, the library model for the closed, the classic approach. This is the open model. You can think of it as an unwalled garden of open license discipleship resources. It's free access. You get into it. You can harvest whatever you find there. And you can become not just a consumer, but a producer as well. You can translate it, you can complete it, you can revise it, adapt it, repurpose it, and then you get to the fun part, which is redistribution. Remember how we talked about those exponential growth curves? If I have Open Bible Stories today on my phone, and I give it to 2 friends on their phones today, and tomorrow they give it to 2 friends on their phones, and the next day the process continues. In a little over 1 month, the entire planet gets a copy of that. That's the power of multiplication. And we're, I guess, not wired to really be able to get that intuitively, but that's how fast you can go. Obviously, it's hypothetical. That would be just one language. But you can see what happens when we cut the strings and go offline and stop counting and let people take it and do whatever they need to do to get it to the ends of the earth. It can just be an explosion in all the good senses of the term. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, going back to the previous slide, what happens when someone is quite happy to give an attribution to whoever produced the content, but then doesn't want to? Maybe they make changes or something, and they don't want to actually release that new thing.
You don't want your name associated with it.
Well, yeah, that's fine. It's maybe they don't want to then have other people getting hold of that for free because they've done some work they want to keep for themselves, or charge for or put copyright on or whatever. But they're now forced to give that away for free.
That's correct. Their use of the content is subject to their agreement to release what they create from it under the same license.
But is there other options for them to?
They can go for a separate license agreement if they want, and then the owner of the content can dual license it.
Yeah.
But that would require a separate agreement. No. If it's the content that they themselves created, I write a book, I release it under an open license, and it goes crazy and everyone gets it for free. I now do revision 2. It's my own work. I'm not required to release it under the same license. It's my stuff. You can have the other one under that license, but this new one is all rights reserved, and I'm going to make $1 million off it, that kind of approach.
Yeah, I just meant if the second author who's taken the original work, they then change, say, a chapter, they swap it out, and that's effectively a whole new work in some ways, and so they then don't want that all to be freely available.
Whatever has already been released, it's an irrevocable license.
Right.
So that content never goes back, and that is very much by design. You can't build on stuff that could be swiped out from under you at any point in the future. So once you go open, it's open for all of time. And when you think about it, that's actually a really good thing. But it can be something that you really want to think about first. Let's keep moving on this. Some observations about 21st century world missions. We've already covered this. The mobile phone is the Gutenberg press for the global church. In 21st century missions, the key is derivatives. The key is not distribution. Distribution is important, but distribution only works within one language. That's getting this to them in one language. What we're talking about is derivatives. We've got nearly 7,000 languages that need to get this content. That's called translation, and translations are derivative work. So the key focal point is enabling people to make derivatives, and then distribution is going to be, by comparison, very much fun. Technology is easy. It's content and rights that is what's difficult. Content is extremely painstaking to create. Getting rights to distribute that and use it and translate it and adapt it is a huge bottleneck. By comparison, technology is a piece of cake. Once we get content that we can actually use, it's sheer joy figuring out what many different formats we can put this in and what phone, and that is great fun. Get some high school techies to do that. That's no problem. Some observations about the open model. This is not new. Luther did this first. You know that the Reformation happened 200 years before the advent of copyright law? That is not an insignificant point. There are some who would maintain, and I would agree, that the Reformation could not have happened, at least not in the way it did, to the extent that it did, if copyright law had come first. Let me tell you why. The way Luther made his livelihood, he was a university professor and received donations, basically, from benefactors. So what he wrote, he did not need to monetize. So he would write a pamphlet. Every printer in Wittenberg would get that pamphlet because they were hot items. They would recreate it on their own press, and they would sell it to as many people as they possibly could. Now, that accomplished two things. One, it kept the price for each pamphlet down to very, very minimal. No one could price gouge because there was no monopoly. The law that would enable that was not to be invented for another 200 years. So the price stayed low, and the distribution rate went viral, quite literally, because any printer who happened to buy one of those copies would go right back to his print shop and do the exact same thing for his clientele. So using the analog media of the day without copyright restrictions resulted in an explosion that forever changed the world. What we're suggesting here is a voluntary return to that kind of openness that existed before copyright law and the default of all rights reserved. Second observation is that in the open world, every technology that provides a way to distribute content faster, cheaper, easier is a huge asset. It's an ally. It's an advantage. It's not a threat. BitTorrent is our best friend because that keeps our distribution costs really low. That's not a problem. That's not a threat. That's a really good thing. Third, we want to consider that centralization and standardization, there's a real drive for that in some arenas these days. We can tend to believe that it's intrinsically a good thing in and of itself. I mean, it sounds good, right? It can be, but it can also not be, depending on certain factors that may or may not be in place. This move to centralization and standardization is also not new. That happened right around the 4th century. That was the motivation that Constantine had for uniting these scattered churches that were not unified. And he centralized and he standardized. And in short order, we had the Dark Ages that lasted for quite a long time. What got us out of the Dark Ages was freedom. Centralization plus standardization plus freedom is intrinsically a good thing. But if you miss the freedom part, danger ahead. There's more illustrations on that as well. The same thing happened in the 18th century. China got closed off because of a move to centralize under a Western entity, basically. And the emperor said, you know what? This is all about you. We're out of here. And the church suddenly found themselves in a hard place in China. Point 4, as I mentioned, the antidote to the Dark Ages is freedom, autonomy. Let's face it, freedom can get messy, but the opposite of not having freedom is a far worse thing. Open is on the rise everywhere. Have you seen this? Linux, the operating system that started as a hacker project on a mailing list in 1991, powers 2/3 of the internet, most of the internet backbone. The vast majority of the top 500 supercomputers and 3 out of 4 new smartphones run Linux. Open has really, really come into its own in the software world. Knowledge, open knowledge, projects like Wikipedia, OpenStreetMap, those, by the way, use the attribution share-alike license. And Linux uses the technical equivalent of the attribution share-alike license in the software world. Open education is the next big thing that a lot of people are saying. This is big. Open textbooks, think about it. You never have to pay for textbooks again. They're under an open license. You download it to your iPad or whatever, and you don't have to pay those wild fees for books. This is a revolution waiting to happen. Open is on the rise. Questions on this? Very good. Well, it's a huge part of it because that's right. In the classic model, it's holding on to the rights that provides the funding even for free content, because exactly like we heard yesterday, that provides a revenue stream. If you're the exclusive channel, then donors come to you. And that is, we're not knocking that. We're saying that is valid, it's legit, and it works. But we're also looking at the advantages that happen if we can come up with a way to fund the projects, but to do it without restricting anything. And I think we can, which brings me to my next slide. How do we sustain the open model? Who's familiar with the term cognitive surplus? Have you ever heard this? It comes from a book by Clay Shirky that if you're looking for a book that will stretch your mind, that is a really, really good one. It talks about basically cognitive surplus is the aggregate free time of a particular group of people. So we go home, end of the day, the kids are in bed, I have 2-3 hours. What do I do with that? That is my cognitive surplus. Now I can turn my brains to mush in front of the TV, or I could decide, you know what? I want to edit an entry in Wikipedia because I happen to know stuff about this, and I want to make the world a better place. That's why an awful lot of people do Wikipedia. That's why they put stuff in there, because it's fun. It's fun to help other people. That's cognitive surplus. When you combine the concept of open collaboration as a means for creating massive amounts of content, I'll tell you about my book in the next slide, because we've documented this, how much aggregate cognitive surplus we have as a global church. We could literally recreate the entire Wikipedia in English every month if 1 out of, I believe, I'm going to get my numbers wrong, 1 out of 100 people would spend 1 hour a month doing that. Don't quote me on that. It's unbelievable what we could do. It's just, we've never even realized that this is an asset that we could harness for fulfilling the Great Commission. Our free time, what are we doing with that? What are the people in the villages doing, on survey in Papua New Guinea? Sun goes down, there's no lanterns, there's nothing, we're all milling around. And now they have cell phones. What if they were using that free time and there was some way for them to actually plug in to equipping themselves? That is a completely free way to create massive amounts of content. We all have free time. We all have stuff that we could use that for. Another means of sustaining the open model is the voluntary early release of content. The law says you can hold on to your copyrighted work for 70 years after you're dead. Your kids can't. At least. That's just the way it works. That's how it is. What if you said, you know what? I don't need it for that long. What if I only need it for 50 years after I'm dead? Or what if you said, I only need it for about 2 years, and then I'm going to release it under an open license? We're hearing of authors, of Christian resources coming to publishers after 3 years saying, the economic value of my book is pretty much all used up. What can I do with it now? The problem is they have often signed over all the rights to the publisher, and unless the publisher wants to release it, they're dead in the water. So authors maybe want to think about this. What if you only gave limited time to the publisher to hold on to that, and say after 3 years, you're going to go open source with it. You're going to open license that, and you're going to let the global church have it and use it in whatever way they can to equip themselves. You're still going to make pretty much as much money as you would have, which brings me to the second part of this, out-of-print works. You know that up to 95% of the 20th century is out of print and under copyright? You ever seen these? Grandpa's bookshelf? Like, what is this book? I had no idea. You know, who wrote this? And you'll never get it in print anymore. No one's going to republish that. There's no commercial value for it, but it's under copyright. So it can't be digitized, and it can't be redistributed. What if those who own those said, you know what, it's doing us no good in a vault. What if we unleashed it on the global church? They're not going to lose any money from that. In fact, they will probably gain money through sales of other resources as people come to their website to get this. 2 minutes. Okay, got it. Sponsored works. This is how Luther did it. Churches, seminaries, you name it. What if the wages that were paid were for a resource that benefited everyone for all of time, and not just, okay, now we're going to sell this and we're going to hold on to it, and then it will gradually no longer be used because it's under copyright and no one gets access to it. And a gift. Some people are going to say, you know what? I believe God is calling me to create this work and to release it out of the chute, and I don't know how he's going to provide for me, but I'm going to trust him. We're going to do it. That's a valid model. We're already seeing people stepping forward saying, I want to do that. This is the book that I've been working on this last year, which documents every step of the way. The goal I was explaining to Clyde earlier, I really think I told him about this. I think he maybe doesn't remember, but I could be wrong about that. I'll take the fall. I should have told him. I explained it to Clyde as trying to put all the puzzle pieces on the table and then assembling the puzzle so that you get the right picture. Because what we're finding in explaining this new approach is that a lot of people have some of the pieces, and a lot of people have some of the other pieces, but it's difficult to get all of the pieces together in one place and understand how they fit. That will be for sale. It'll be $42, and it'll be released under an open license. That'd be fine, but it would be a little disingenuous if I tried to do that with this particular work. That will be released under an open license, and all the digital versions will be free. We hope to have it out in January, maybe February, depending on when the final review completes. And it will not be published as 1.0 at that point. It will be 0.9. So if you want to speak into it and help us finish it, we would welcome that. And I am done. Thank you, Clyde.
Woo! Thank you. Was I right? Is that guy just brilliant? Great communicator. Look forward to the book.